For thousands of years, the act of draining blood from a human body was not seen as barbaric or senseless. It was seen as science, as healing, even as salvation. Across civilizations, from the marble halls of ancient Greece to the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe, one treatment was prescribed with unwavering confidence: bloodletting. It is difficult for us today to imagine doctors, educated men, revered in their communities, pressing sharp blades into a patient's skin or unleashing wriggling leeches upon their flesh, believing sincerely that the more blood flowed out, the closer their patients would be to health. And yet, for over 2 millennia, this ritual was not only common but considered essential to human survival. The origins of bloodletting reach back to the age of Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine. His theory of the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated medical thinking for centuries. Illness, he taught, was the result of imbalance. A fever meant an excess of blood, a lethargy suggested too much phlegm, melancholy hinted at an overflow of black bile. To cure the patient, the physician must restore harmony, and the simplest way to reduce a surplus of blood was obvious: let it out. This idea spread like gospel through the Roman Empire, refined by Galen, who mapped out elaborate instructions on when and where to bleed a person, down to which vein should be opened depending on the disease. By the Middle Ages, the practice had taken on a ritualistic quality. In candlelit rooms that smelled of sweat, iron, and old wood, patients would sit trembling as the barber-surgeon approached. Barbers at the time were more than just hair cutters; they were surgeons, tooth-pullers, and above all, bloodletters. The iconic red and white barber pole that still spins outside shops today is a relic of this past: the red for blood, the white for bandages, the pole itself recalling the stick that patients squeezed to make their veins bulge. A small incision, a controlled trickle, and a bowl placed carefully beneath the arm to catch the life force dripping out. To the sick, it was not horror, it was hope. The scope of ailments treated with bloodletting was astonishing. Headaches, fevers, infections, epilepsy, pneumonia, smallpox, even the plague, all were met with the same remedy. Too much blood in the system, the physicians insisted, was the root cause of suffering. If the patient grew pale, dizzy, or collapsed, that was not failure, it was proof that the treatment was working. The closer one seemed to death, the closer one must be to recovery. Records from monasteries and royal courts reveal that kings, peasants, monks, and merchants alike submitted themselves to the lancet, proving that this was not merely a treatment of the poor or desperate, it was embraced by all ranks of society. Of course, not all bloodletting was done with blades. By the Renaissance, leeches had become indispensable allies of the medical profession. Physicians carried them in jars, dark creatures wriggling in stagnant water, ready to be pressed onto swollen limbs or feverish foreheads. The leeches did their silent work, swelling with blood until they dropped away like little living syringes. They were seen as gentler, more refined, a natural tool provided by the earth itself. Some doctors even specified the number of leeches to be applied for particular diseases: 6 for headaches, 10 for pneumonia, dozens for fevers that threatened to burn the body alive. Pharmacies across Europe stocked leeches by the thousands, with trade routes devoted to their capture and distribution. So high was the demand that in France during the 19th century, tens of millions of leeches were imported annually. To be treated by leeches was to be treated by the latest science. But science, as it often does, blurred into superstition. Bloodletting was prescribed not only according to symptoms but according to astrology. Medieval physicians consulted star charts, declaring that the position of the moon or the alignment of planets determined the best day to open a vein. Almanacs circulated showing diagrams of the human body, marked with signs of the zodiac, each limb and organ under the rule of a star. A farmer with a fever might be told to wait until the waning moon before the treatment could work. Illness, medicine, and the heavens were woven together in a tapestry that seemed unbreakable. The dangers, of course, were immense. Many patients did not recover from the bloodletting itself. Take, for example, the most famous case in American history, George Washington, the first President of the United States. In December of 1799, he developed a sore throat and fever. His doctors responded with the trusted method: they bled him. And then they bled him again. And again. In less than a day, over 2 liters of blood were drained from his body. Washington grew weaker, his breathing shallow, his pulse faint. He died that night, not from the infection, but almost certainly from the cure. And yet, his death did little to shake the faith in bloodletting. The practice carried on for decades more, defended with stubborn conviction. Why did bloodletting persist for so long, despite mounting evidence of its dangers? The answer lies in the way humans interpret illness. When a patient survived after being bled, the cure was praised. When a patient died, the blame fell not on the treatment but on the severity of the disease, or the lateness of intervention. Confirmation bias reinforced the cycle. Doctors saw only proof of their wisdom, never evidence of their error. And the patients, desperate for relief, placed their trust in the authority of white coats and silver instruments. Medicine is as much belief as it is science, and bloodletting thrived in the space between the two. By the 19th century, cracks in the system began to appear. New approaches to medicine, rooted in observation and experimentation, challenged the old ways. Pierre Louis, a French physician, conducted one of the first clinical trials, studying the outcomes of bloodletting in pneumonia patients. His results were shocking: those who were not bled had better chances of survival. The medical establishment resisted, but slowly, the tide began to turn. The lancet dulled, the leach jars gathered dust. Yet, in remote villages and hidden corners of the world, bloodletting never fully disappeared. Even today, echoes remain. Modern medicine still employs a form of therapeutic phlebotomy for conditions like hemochromatosis, where excess iron in the blood must be reduced. The ancient instinct lingers, reshaped but not forgotten. Bloodletting was more than a medical practice, it was a cultural ritual, a window into how humans once understood their own bodies. It reveals our deep fear of imbalance, our willingness to endure pain for the promise of healing, and our extraordinary ability to justify even the most harmful traditions when wrapped in the cloak of science. To study it is to see ourselves not as enlightened moderns mocking the ignorance of the past, but as participants in an unending experiment called medicine. For if bloodletting seemed obvious to them, what practices today will future generations condemn as absurd, even monstrous? The answer is as unsettling as the sight of a leech crawling across pale skin, searching for a vein. Long before hospitals, long before microscopes, and even long before written history, human beings attempted one of the most shocking medical interventions imaginable: cutting into the skull. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls from as far back as 7,000 years ago, bearing precise, circular holes carved into the bone. Some of these skulls show signs of healing, the bone knitting around the edges, proof that the patient survived. Others bear clean, deliberate openings with no signs of recovery, suggesting the procedure was fatal. This ancient practice has a name: trepanation, and it remains one of the most mysterious and unsettling chapters in the history of medicine. To imagine trepanation, picture a prehistoric healer crouched over a patient, stone tools in hand, chipping away carefully at the thick bone of the cranium. There is no anesthesia, no sterile equipment, no understanding of germs or infection. And yet, for reasons that range from spiritual to medicinal, countless societies across the world performed this procedure. Why would anyone risk boring a hole into the very vault that protects the brain, the seat of thought and life itself? The answers lie in the universal human struggle against pain, disease, and forces unseen. For many early cultures, illness was not simply biological, it was spiritual. Epilepsy, migraines, and mental disturbances were often attributed to demons trapped inside the skull or evil spirits clouding the mind. By cutting open the head, healers believed they were giving the spirits a way out. Imagine a terrified patient writhing with seizures, and a healer proclaiming that liberation could come through an opening carved into the bone. It was a blend of ritual and remedy, half religion and half surgery. And astonishingly, in some cases, it may have worked, not by freeing spirits, but by relieving pressure caused by head trauma or swelling in the brain. Accident and superstition had, perhaps, stumbled into something with a kernel of truth. Evidence of trepanation spans continents, revealing that this was not an isolated idea but a near-universal impulse. In South America, the Inca civilization became particularly skilled at the practice. Archaeological finds in Peru reveal skulls with multiple trepanations, some showing survival after several operations. It seems that Incan surgeons treated battlefield injuries this way, releasing blood clots and pressure after a blow to the head. Their tools were sharper, their technique more refined, and their patients, amazingly, often lived to tell the tale. Survival rates, according to some studies of Incan skulls, may have been higher than those of European battlefield surgeons centuries later. In this strange twist, the so-called primitive practitioners may have outperformed their more civilized successors. Meanwhile, in Europe, trepanation persisted well into the Middle Ages. Medieval physicians, steeped in Galenic theories, recommended it for head injuries, seizures, or even melancholy. A surgeon would fix the patient in place, perhaps with assistants holding them down, and apply a sharp trephine, a metal instrument resembling a drill or saw. The device would bore into the skull in a slow, circular motion, grinding through bone while the patient screamed or fell unconscious from shock. Monastic records describe such procedures in chilling detail, recounting the careful removal of bone fragments in hopes of relieving pressure or restoring sanity. The risk of infection was astronomical, but desperation often outweighed fear. By the Renaissance, trepanation had become a symbol of both medical ambition and folly. Detailed engravings from surgical manuals show physicians confidently wielding elaborate trephines, surrounded by instruments laid out like tools in a carpenter's workshop. Some patients survived, though many did not. And yet the procedure remained a respected part of the surgeon's arsenal, a testimony to the enduring belief that intervention, even at the cost of carving open the skull, was preferable to doing nothing. In a world where fevers killed, where plagues swept entire towns, where madness had no cure, any chance of relief seemed worth the gamble. What makes trepanation especially fascinating is how it blurs the line between medicine and ritual. In some communities, the extracted bone disc was kept as an amulet, believed to hold protective powers. Worn around the neck or sewn into clothing, it was a charm against misfortune. Here, surgery was not only a matter of physical healing but a doorway into the mystical. The body, the soul, and the unseen forces of the cosmos were thought to be linked, and trepanation sat squarely at their intersection. It was both a desperate medical treatment and a sacred act. Even more astonishing is that trepanation has never fully disappeared. In the 20th century, fringe groups revived the practice, arguing, without evidence, that drilling a hole in the skull increased blood flow to the brain or heightened consciousness. In the 1960s, a Dutch medical student even performed the procedure on himself, documenting the act with photographs and advocating for its benefits. His work inspired a small movement of so-called modern trepanists, who believed that opening the skull was a gateway to expanded awareness. It was not mainstream science, but it demonstrated how the echoes of ancient practices can resurface in new, unsettling ways. To look at a trepanned skull in a museum today is to feel a shiver of both horror and respect. Horror at the raw violence of the act, respect at the courage, or desperation, of those who endured it. The holes are often remarkably smooth, edges rounded by careful work and, in cases of survival, by bone regrowth. These silent witnesses remind us that medicine has always walked a knife's edge between harm and healing. Trepanation may strike us as madness, but for those who lived in times of constant danger and limited knowledge, it was an act of hope, a last resort against forces they could neither see nor control. Trepanation stands as one of the oldest known surgical procedures, a testament to humanity's willingness to cut into the unknown in search of relief. It tells us that the history of medicine is not a straight line of progress but a winding path, filled with experiments that seem unthinkable today yet paved the way for what came after. From chipped stone tools to gleaming surgical drills, the impulse has remained the same: to intervene, to save, to heal, even if it means venturing inside the very walls that guard the human mind. And so, as the story of trepanation fades into the background of history, it leaves us with one haunting question: how far would you let someone go, if you believed it was the only way to be cured? Few things reveal the contradictions of medical history more than the strange reliance on poisons as cures. For centuries, substances we now regard as lethal were embraced as miracle drugs, prescribed by physicians with confidence and consumed by patients desperate for relief. Among them, none is more infamous than mercury, gleaming, liquid metal that fascinated and destroyed in equal measure. Alongside it stood arsenic, antimony, and other toxic elements, which filled the medicine cabinets of both kings and commoners. To us today, these treatments seem closer to assassination than healing, but to the people of the past, they represented hope. Mercury's story begins with alchemy, that curious blend of science, mysticism, and experimentation that flourished in the ancient and medieval worlds. The shimmering liquid, heavy yet fluid, seemed otherworldly. To alchemists, mercury was a mystical element, linked to transformation and eternal life. They believed it could purify the body, cleanse impurities, and even grant longevity. Over time, these ideas filtered into medicine. By the Renaissance, physicians were prescribing mercury in various forms, ointments, pills, vapors, to combat one of the most feared diseases of the age, syphilis. Syphilis, often called the Great Pox, spread through Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, leaving horrific sores, blindness, insanity, and death in its wake. Doctors had no idea what caused it, but they were desperate for a cure. Mercury became the weapon of choice. Patients were slathered in mercury ointments, made to swallow mercury pills, or placed in special, sweating chambers, where vapors of the metal filled the air. Physicians swore by a grim saying, "A night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury." To them, the cure was worse than the disease, but it was the only remedy they believed could work. The effects, however, were devastating. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, drooling, rotting gums, and teeth that fell out one by one. Some patients lost their sanity, others wasted away, their bodies collapsing under the treatment meant to save them. And yet, the treatment persisted for centuries. The irony is painful: in trying to cure syphilis, physicians inflicted a slow, metallic death. Still, in the absence of alternatives, people lined up for it, willing to risk everything for a chance at relief. If mercury was the shining star of toxic medicine, arsenic was its shadowy counterpart. Known since antiquity as a deadly poison, favored by assassins and whispered about in tales of intrigue, arsenic nevertheless became a trusted ingredient in treatments. During the 18th and 19th centuries, it was mixed into tonics and pills, marketed as a cure for fevers, skin conditions, even malaria. Doctors believed small doses of arsenic could stimulate the body, restore energy, and ward off illness. It was the paradox of "the dose makes the poison." In minuscule amounts, they hoped the deadly substance could become therapeutic. One of the most notorious arsenic-based medicines was Fowler's solution, a concoction of potassium arsenite introduced in the late 18th century. For over a century, it was widely prescribed for everything from psoriasis to rheumatism, and even as a general health tonic. Patients swore it made them feel stronger, more vibrant. But beneath the surface, arsenic was building up in their bodies, damaging organs, altering skin pigmentation, and in many cases leading to cancer. The line between remedy and poison was thin, and too often crossed without recognition. Even more bizarre was the use of antimony, another toxic metal. Antimony was prized for its ability to induce vomiting. Physicians believed that forcing the body to expel its contents could rid it of disease. Special antimony cups were used to prepare wine. The drink, infused with the metal, acted as a powerful emetic. People drank, vomited violently, and believed they had purged themselves of illness. In some cases, families passed down antimony cups as heirlooms, a deadly treasure used again and again to cleanse the body. It was medicine by ordeal, suffering mistaken for cure. What makes these poisonous treatments even more striking is how they coexisted with luxury and beauty. In the 18th and 19th centuries, arsenic became a fashionable ingredient in cosmetics. Women applied arsenic-based powders to their skin for a pale, ghostly complexion, admired as the height of beauty. Some even took arsenic wafers, sold as beauty pills, to maintain their fragile appearance. The slow poisoning was invisible, masked by the allure of vanity. In this way, medicine and fashion intertwined, each reinforcing the dangerous embrace of toxins. The persistence of these treatments reveals something profound about the history of healing. Medicine has always walked a fine line between cure and harm, guided not only by science but by belief, culture, and desperation. In an age with no antibiotics, no vaccines, no true understanding of infection, the willingness to try dangerous substances made sense. If an illness was certain death, why not risk the unknown? Patients and doctors alike clung to the faintest promise of relief, even when the cost was measured in suffering and shortened lives. And in some strange ways, the experiments with poisons did pave the way for modern medicine. Arsenic, for example, became the basis for salvarsan, one of the first effective treatments for syphilis discovered in the early 20th century. It was a toxic compound, yes, but carefully calibrated, it marked a step toward targeted drug therapy. The principle of using dangerous substances in controlled doses carried forward into chemotherapy, where poisons are wielded deliberately against cancer cells. Even mercury found a lingering role in medicine, used in small amounts in thermometers, antiseptics, and dental fillings well into the modern age. Yet, when we look back, the human cost cannot be ignored. The images are haunting: patients drenched in mercury sweat baths, noblewomen powdering their faces with arsenic, families vomiting together after drinking from an antimony cup. These treatments, embraced with hope, were betrayals of the very trust placed in physicians. They remind us that medicine is never free from error, and that the confidence of experts can sometimes be more dangerous than ignorance. The story of poisons as medicine is not merely about mistakes, it is about the willingness to risk, to gamble, to confront death in the name of life. It is about the blurred line between healer and executioner, between remedy and toxin. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: what we see today as progress may one day be judged just as harshly. For as mercury and arsenic once gleamed with the promise of healing, so too do our modern miracle drugs and experimental therapies carry shadows we may not yet see. History whispers a warning: the cure can be as deadly as the disease. Few practices in the history of medicine are as grotesque, and yet as widely accepted, as the use of human remains as medicine. For centuries, European physicians, pharmacists, and even monarchs consumed remedies made not from plants or minerals, but from the dead. Ground bones, dried flesh, and powdered skulls were not seen as dark sorcery, but as legitimate prescriptions. It was called corpse medicine, and at its height, it was as ordinary as taking aspirin today. This macabre tradition reveals how desperation and belief can push societies into embracing the unthinkable. It began with the allure of ancient Egypt. By the Middle Ages, Europeans had developed a fascination with mummies. Traders brought preserved bodies out of tombs, selling them as curiosities and relics. Soon, apothecaries began grinding mummy flesh into powder, marketing it as mumia. Physicians claimed it could cure bleeding, bruising, and even the plague. To ingest the flesh of the embalmed dead was to harness their preserved vitality. Demand grew so high that Egypt's tombs were plundered not for gold, but for bodies. In time, when the supply of authentic mummies ran short, unscrupulous merchants resorted to fakes, dried corpses of executed criminals or the poor, passed off as ancient kings and queens, crushed into the same grisly powder. But this trade was not confined to shadowy back alleys. Royal courts and wealthy households stocked mumia as part of their medical supplies. King Francis I of France reportedly carried a pouch of powdered mummy with him wherever he went, convinced it could save his life if he were poisoned. Nobility swallowed the ground remains of ancient strangers with as much confidence as they drank wine. In an age where sickness could strike at any moment, no remedy, however revolting, was dismissed outright. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern era, corpse medicine evolved into even darker forms. Human fat was harvested and used to make salves, believed to soothe pain and heal wounds. Executioners, whose profession brought them into contact with the freshly dead, often sold strips of fat or vials of blood to physicians. It was said that drinking the warm blood of an executed criminal could cure epilepsy or impart strength. Crowds at public executions sometimes rushed forward, cups in hand, to collect the spurting blood of the condemned, treating the scaffold as a pharmacy. To modern eyes, the sight is unthinkable, but in the minds of those desperate for healing, it was logical. Life force was thought to linger in the body. By consuming it, one might absorb vitality and ward off death. Powdered skull became another staple of the medical trade. It was ground, mixed into drinks, and prescribed for headaches and brain diseases. The idea was simple, like cures like. A skull could heal the ailments of the head, just as bones could heal broken limbs. Apothecaries stocked jars of powdered bone beside their herbs and spices, offering it over the counter. Even the most learned physicians, men who wrote treatises and lectured in universities, endorsed the practice. It was not superstition on the margins, but mainstream medicine in the heart of Europe. Some of the most respected figures of the era partook. The great physician Paracelsus, who revolutionized the study of chemicals in medicine, argued that corpses held powerful healing properties. He believed that the life spirit within the human body could be transferred through carefully prepared remedies. Far from seeing this as barbaric, he regarded it as science, a way of unlocking nature's hidden forces. For him and his followers, corpse medicine was not a descent into savagery but a step toward understanding the mysteries of health. Yet behind these prescriptions lay a chilling reality. Bodies were stolen from graves, purchased from gallows, and treated as commodities. The dead were not allowed rest, they were dissected, boiled, and sold in parts. Poor and criminal bodies were most often used, their flesh turned into medicine for the rich. In this way, cannibal medicine reflected the inequalities of society. Those with wealth and power consumed the powerless, literally taking their bodies for their own survival. Medicine became not just an act of healing, but of exploitation. The practice endured well into the 17th and 18th centuries, long after the Renaissance glow had faded. English physician Thomas Willis, a pioneer in neurology, recommended drinking blood for epilepsy. Across Europe, powdered skulls were still being prescribed for migraines, and fat-based ointments were sold to soothe aches. Apothecaries offered catalogues of human-derived products with no shame or secrecy. The boundary between science and superstition was porous, and as long as patients demanded results, the trade thrived. By the 19th century, corpse medicine began to decline, not because it was recognized as morally abhorrent, but because newer medical advances offered alternatives. The discovery of microbes, vaccines, and effective chemical drugs shifted the balance of healing. Slowly, powdered mummies and human fat salves disappeared from pharmacies. Yet echoes of the practice lingered. In some rural areas, folk remedies involving bones or blood persisted. And even today, the shadows of corpse medicine remain in certain fringe treatments that promise vitality through the consumption of natural, but ethically dubious substances. Looking back, the idea of cannibal medicine horrifies us. The thought of sipping a cup laced with powdered mummy or rubbing ointment made from human fat onto a wound seems barbaric. But to those who lived in centuries of plague, famine, and incurable illness, the choice was simple: accept suffering or try anything. Death was everywhere, and to survive, people were willing to transgress boundaries we now hold sacred. Medicine, in their world, was not only about science, it was about grasping at whatever seemed to hold power, even if that meant turning to the dead. The story of mummy powder and corpse medicine forces us to question the assumptions we make about progress. Were they fools, or simply desperate survivors? Is our own era so different, when people still chase miracle cures, swallow questionable supplements, or undergo risky experimental treatments in the hope of extending life? The boundary between rational medicine and desperate belief is thinner than we like to admit. And history reminds us that when fear of death grows strong enough, humans will consume anything, even each other, in the name of healing. Throughout history, humans have looked not only to plants, minerals, and even corpses for cures, but also to the animal kingdom. The belief that creatures held secret healing powers was nearly universal, crossing continents and cultures. From slimy leeches to household dogs, from pigeons pressed to the skin to cobwebs applied as bandages, animals were not companions or pests alone, they were doctors, living instruments of medicine. Some treatments were rooted in observation, others in pure superstition, but all reveal how deeply people trusted the natural world to provide answers to their suffering. Of all these creatures, none was more enduring, or infamous, than the leech. Although we've already glimpsed its role in bloodletting, its story deserves a closer look, because leeches were more than just an alternative to the surgeon's blade. In the 19th century, they became a global medical craze. Apothecaries ordered barrels filled with thousands of wriggling worms. In France alone, tens of millions were imported every year, sucked onto patients suffering from everything from fevers to high blood pressure. Wealthy families kept leeches in glass jars, like living medicine cabinets, ready to be applied at the first sign of sickness. Their use was so widespread that natural populations were nearly wiped out, with professional leech hunters scouring ponds and marshes to satisfy the insatiable demand. The sight of a pale patient, motionless while leeches swelled black and bloated on their skin, was not shocking, it was medicine at work. Beyond leeches, doctors experimented with more unusual animal remedies. In Europe, pigeons were placed directly onto sick patients' bodies. The logic, if we can call it that, was that pigeons could draw out disease through their flesh. Physicians would split the bird and press its warm body against the soles of a feverish patient's feet, waiting for the life of the animal to somehow absorb the illness. In some cases, entire flocks were sacrificed in the hope of breaking a plague or epidemic. To modern eyes, it seems cruel and irrational, but in an era when medicine offered little else, a pigeon pressed to the body could be a symbol of hope. Dogs, too, were believed to hold healing powers, particularly through their saliva. The phrase, "a dog's lick heals," was not just folklore, it was medical advice. People noticed that when dogs licked their wounds, they often recovered without festering. This observation fed into the belief that dog saliva contained natural healing properties. Some physicians recommended allowing dogs to lick human cuts or sores, convinced it would speed recovery. In rural villages, people whispered of certain breeds being better healers than others. Of course, the truth was more complicated. While a dog's licking sometimes cleaned a wound, it also introduced dangerous bacteria. Still, the image of loyal animals healing their masters reinforced the idea that nature had already equipped the world with doctors of its own. Spiders, despised by many, found their place in medicine as well. Across Europe and Asia, spider webs were gathered and applied to wounds as bandages. The sticky silk helped clot blood, holding it in place and protecting the injury. Whether or not people knew it, spider silk does contain compounds that can help with healing, and so this folk remedy had some basis in truth. The image is vivid: a mother, plucking cobwebs from the corners of a cottage, pressing them gently to her child's scraped knee, believing that the web carried nature's hidden power. What seems strange to us was a perfectly rational use of what was at hand. The use of animals often blurred the line between medicine and magic. In some traditions, toad powder was used to treat seizures. The creature was dried, ground, and swallowed in hopes of passing its strength to the patient. In others, snake skins were worn as charms against illness, or ground into potions to ward off fevers. Even insects played their part. Powdered beetles, ant paste, and lice-based brews were recommended for ailments ranging from indigestion to hair loss. Each cure reflected a deep belief that animals carried vital forces that could be transferred to humans. What is striking is how these remedies were not confined to the poor or uneducated. Learned physicians recommended them, recording their recipes in scholarly texts. Universities taught them, and kings and queens endorsed them. Elizabeth I of England reportedly kept exotic animal-based medicines in her court, while in France, royal physicians experimented with pigeon treatments during outbreaks of plague. These were not strange superstitions on the fringes of society, they were mainstream practice. And yet, behind these practices lay a pattern of desperation. When faced with plagues, fevers, or wounds that defied explanation, people turned to what was familiar and alive. If the human body was failing, perhaps another living being could share its vitality. Sometimes, this led to treatments that had accidental effectiveness, like spider webs for blood clotting. Other times, it resulted in cruelty without cure. The death of countless pigeons and the suffering of leech-covered patients remind us of the cost of misplaced faith in natural remedies. Remarkably, not all of these ideas disappeared. Leeches, written off as medieval relics, have made a modern comeback in microsurgery. Today, they are used to improve blood circulation in reattached limbs, their anticoagulant saliva preventing dangerous clots. What was once dismissed as barbaric has found a refined place in cutting-edge hospitals. Here, history loops back, reminding us that even the strangest traditions may hold a fragment of truth. The history of animals as healers is a mirror reflecting humanity's relationship with nature. It shows us our willingness to look outside ourselves for answers, to see in every creature the possibility of salvation. It also reveals the thin line between science and superstition, between compassion and cruelty. For every spider web that helped close a wound, a pigeon was sacrificed in vain. For every leech that may have eased swelling, countless others drained patients to exhaustion. In these contradictions, we glimpse the essence of pre-modern medicine, the desperate blending of observation, faith, and imagination. To stand in a museum today and see jars filled with dried leeches, or to read of pigeons pressed against the sick, is to feel both revulsion and fascination. It is easy to mock the ignorance of the past, but harder to admit the truth: these people were doing what we still do today. They looked to the natural world for cures, trusted in the unseen powers of biology, and risked much in the hope of saving lives. The difference lies not in their desperation, but in their tools. And if history teaches anything, it is that the line between healing and harming is never as clear as we might wish. Medicine, at its core, has always been a story of improvisation. When faced with disease, people reached for what was at hand: common objects, household items, and substances drawn from kitchens, taverns, and workshops. If plants and animals could heal, why not tobacco smoke, rusty nails, or powdered ivory? The line between tool, food, and medicine blurred, creating a world where ordinary things were transformed into remedies. To us today, these treatments seem bizarre, even laughable. But to those who lived in centuries of uncertainty, they were lifelines, crafted from the familiar objects of daily life. One of the most astonishing examples was the tobacco smoke enema. The treatment, popular in 18th-century Europe, involved inserting a tube into the rectum and blowing tobacco smoke directly into the patient's body. It was believed to stimulate respiration, revive the drowned, and treat colds, headaches, or even hernias. Portable kits were manufactured, complete with bellows, tubes, and pipes, so physicians and even river patrols could administer the cure on the spot. The image is startling: a half-conscious man pulled from the water, attendants rushing not to perform chest compressions but to fill his body with smoke. For a time, this bizarre therapy was accepted as cutting-edge resuscitation. Only later, when the dangers of nicotine became clearer, was the practice quietly abandoned, its instruments left to gather dust in medical museums. Other remedies involved infusing drinks with metal. Rusty nails, for instance, were sometimes steeped in wine, creating an improvised iron tonic. Physicians believed the metallic infusion could strengthen the blood and restore vitality to those suffering from anemia or weakness. The practice lingered into the 19th century, a folk solution passed down through generations. In households where formal medicine was too expensive or too far away, the rusty nail in wine became a symbol of resourcefulness. Strangely enough, the idea wasn't entirely misguided. Iron is indeed vital for blood health, though the delivery method was crude, unsanitary, and often harmful. Powdered ivory and ground gemstones also made their way into medicine chests. The wealthy, in particular, believed that rare and precious materials must hold extraordinary healing powers. Ivory was thought to stop bleeding or protect against poisoning when ingested in small amounts. Crushed emeralds and pearls were prescribed for epilepsy or stomach troubles. These remedies reflected not only medical theories but also social status. To consume powdered gems was to display wealth as much as to pursue health. In this way, medicine became a theater of prestige, where cures sparkled as brightly as the jewels from which they were made. Even more curious were remedies that borrowed from household routines. Vinegar-soaked sponges were held to the nose to ward off plague, believed to cleanse the air of miasma, the invisible corruption thought to spread disease. Bread was pressed to wounds, the soft crumb used to draw out infection like a poultice. In some cases, hot bread was applied to the chest to soothe coughs or fevers. Kitchens doubled as pharmacies, and every loaf or cask could be repurposed as treatment. The boundaries between nourishment and medicine dissolved, as survival demanded innovation with whatever lay at hand. Tobacco, beyond its smoky enemas, found endless uses in medicine. In the 17th century, it was hailed as a universal cure, smoked for lung ailments, chewed for toothaches, snuffed for headaches, and applied as poultices to wounds. Doctors praised its versatility, calling it God's remedy. Yet its addictive qualities ensured its place not only in medicine but in culture. Patients grew reliant on it, mistaking dependence for healing. It is a sobering reminder of how easily harmful substances can masquerade as panaceas when clothed in the authority of medical advice. Sometimes, the strangest remedies came not from physicians but from folk tradition. Housewives recommended carrying a potato in one's pocket to cure rheumatism, believing the tuber absorbed pain. Blacksmiths prescribed swallowing filings from iron tools to strengthen the body. Farmers brewed concoctions with soot scraped from chimneys, convinced it warded off stomach illness. Each cure reflected an attempt to impose order on chaos, to make illness intelligible and treatable through familiar, tangible means. In a world where medicine was often inaccessible, these home cures became acts of empowerment. What is fascinating is how many of these odd practices were later adopted by elites. When physicians endorsed them, they moved from superstition to science, or at least to something resembling it. The tobacco smoke enema, once a riverbank improvisation, was institutionalized with official kits. Rusty nail tonics, long a peasant's cure, gained credibility in medical circles as iron's importance became known. This blending of folk wisdom and professional authority blurred the distinction between common sense and quackery, leaving patients caught in the middle. The reliance on everyday objects also speaks to the psychology of healing. When illness struck, people wanted remedies they could see, touch, and believe in. A loaf of bread pressed to the chest, a nail steeped in wine, a potato in the pocket, these were tangible symbols of action, proof that something was being done. Even if the cure failed, the ritual itself provided comfort, a sense of control in a world of uncertainty. Medicine, after all, has always been as much about belief as about biology. Looking back, these treatments strike us as absurd, even comical. But it is worth asking how different they truly are from some of our own practices. We still turn to supplements of dubious value, to wellness trends promising vitality through crystals, detoxes, or herbal teas. We still blur the line between nourishment and cure, between ritual and science. History suggests that this impulse is timeless. When confronted with the mysteries of the body, humans will always look first to what is close at hand, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary in their quest for healing. The story of everyday objects turned into cures is, in the end, a story about creativity and desperation. It reveals a world where medicine was not confined to hospitals or laboratories but woven into the fabric of daily life. The kitchen, the workshop, the field, all became pharmacies. In their ingenuity, people found hope. In their errors, they left us reminders of how easily hope can slide into folly. And in their persistence, they showed us the enduring truth: when faced with sickness, humans will try anything, even a pipe of smoke or a nail in wine, if it means clinging to life for one more day. The 19th century was a time of breathtaking change. Steam powered the factories, railways stitched continents together, and electricity, mysterious, invisible, and seemingly limitless, captured the imagination of scientists and dreamers alike. If lightning could split a tree, if sparks could leap across the air with a crack, then surely this force must hold power over the human body. Electricity was the future, and in medicine, it became both a promise and a playground for quacks. What followed was an era in which machines buzzed, belts vibrated, and helmets pulsed with current, all sold as cures for ailments that had tormented humanity for centuries. The fascination began with genuine experiments. In the late 18th century, Luigi Galvani discovered that a frog's leg twitched when touched with a charged metal. Electricity, it seemed, was the spark of life itself. This idea electrified Europe. If current could make dead muscle jump, perhaps it could revive the living, stimulate nerves, or awaken paralyzed limbs. Physicians and showmen alike began experimenting with galvanism, applying currents to patients suffering from paralysis, hysteria, or depression. Some reported miraculous improvements, others suffered burns, shocks, and disappointment. But the seed was planted. Electricity and health were linked in the public imagination. By the Victorian era, inventors flooded the market with devices that promised to harness this invisible energy. Electrotherapy machines appeared in doctors' offices and parlors, often resembling a cross between scientific instruments and torture devices. Patients gripped metal rods while weak currents passed through their bodies, producing tingles, spasms, or mild shocks. The sensation alone was enough to convince many that something powerful was happening. Advertisements promised that electricity could cure nervous disorders, impotence, headaches, even melancholia. Brochures declared it the natural life force, able to realign the body and restore vitality. It wasn't only electricity that fascinated quack healers, it was the broader idea of vibration. The Industrial Revolution filled cities with the hum of machines, and inventors wondered if mechanical vibrations could act as medicine. Soon, vibrating chairs, belts, and handheld devices entered the market, each promising to shake the sickness out of the body. Some claimed vibrations could stimulate digestion, others that they could dissolve fat, cure constipation, or invigorate the nerves. Patients were strapped into machines that pounded, shook, or buzzed, enduring the ordeal in the belief that health was being mechanically forced back into their bodies. Among the strangest of these contraptions were the so-called electromagnetic belts. These wearable devices, lined with coils and wires, claimed to deliver a constant healing current to the wearer. Sold by traveling salesmen and advertised in newspapers, they were marketed as universal cures, where the belt, and your aches, weakness, and sexual troubles would vanish. Testimonials, often fabricated, filled pamphlets with stories of men restored to vigor and women cured of nervous hysteria. In reality, most belts delivered no current at all. They were scams, cleverly designed props that preyed on the hopes of the sick. And yet, thousands were sold, testament to the desperation of an age in which doctors had few real treatments to offer. Electrotherapy's reach extended even into mental health. In the early 20th century, electricity was formally introduced into psychiatric care with shock treatments. The theory was crude, that seizures, induced by powerful electric currents, could reset the brain and cure disorders like schizophrenia or depression. Electroconvulsive therapy, as it came to be known, was often performed without anesthesia, leaving patients bruised, traumatized, and in some cases severely harmed. For decades, it was applied liberally in asylums, more as a tool of control than of healing. Though later refined and still used in certain cases today, its brutal beginnings remain a haunting reminder of how far enthusiasm for electricity could go. Meanwhile, the market for quack devices only grew. In American catalogs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pages were filled with gadgets promising health through electrical stimulation. Electric brushes, claimed to cure baldness by charging the scalp. Electromassage gloves delivered mild shocks through the hands, supposedly transferring healing currents during a massage. There were even electric corsets, designed to restore posture and vigor through a combination of fashion and pseudoscience. These devices played on both scientific excitement and social anxieties, offering easy solutions to problems that medicine could not yet solve. The popularity of these machines was not simply about gullibility, it was about hope. In an age when diseases like tuberculosis, syphilis, and cancer were often untreatable, electricity offered a glimpse of progress. It was modern, scientific, and tangible. Patients could feel it coursing through their skin, a sensation that proved, at least to them, that something was happening. The hum of the machine, the spark of the current, the mechanical vibrations, all gave a sense of action in a world where medicine often consisted of waiting and praying. Some devices, remarkably, did have limited effectiveness. Gentle electrical stimulation could help certain forms of paralysis by keeping muscles active. Vibration therapy occasionally improved circulation or digestion. These accidental benefits blurred the line between quackery and science, making it harder to dismiss all devices as fraudulent. But for every patient who felt improvement, countless others were exploited, their suffering turned into profit for opportunists who promised miracles in brass and wire. Even as late as the 1920s and 1930s, bizarre electrical devices continued to be marketed with confidence. The violet ray machine, a handheld device emitting a buzzing purple glow, was sold for home use, claiming to cure everything from acne to arthritis. Families purchased them eagerly, sitting in darkened rooms while the eerie light danced across their skin. The machine's real effect was little more than a mild shock, but in the imagination of users, it was a beacon of modern science at work. Looking back, the age of electrotherapy and quack devices reveals both the vulnerability and the ingenuity of the human spirit. Faced with diseases they could not understand, people embraced the newest technology, convinced that progress must hold the key. Electricity was mysterious, powerful, and omnipresent, qualities that made it the perfect vessel for hope. The machines themselves, with their brass knobs, polished wood, and humming coils, looked like instruments of science, and in a time of rapid change, appearance was often enough to inspire trust. Today, many of these devices sit in museums of medical history, their wires frayed, their glass tubes dulled. Visitors laugh at the absurd claims, shaking their heads at how easily people were fooled. But perhaps we should not laugh too hard. For our own age is filled with gadgets, supplements, and wellness fads that promise vitality and cure without solid proof. From magnetic bracelets to detox machines, the echoes of the electrotherapy craze still resonate. The story of quack devices reminds us that desperation and hope are powerful forces, and that even the brightest technologies can cast shadows of exploitation. Electricity, once the mysterious frontier, is now harnessed safely in countless medical technologies, pacemakers, nerve stimulators, defibrillators. The dream that currents could heal was not entirely wrong, it was simply unrefined, distorted by opportunists who turned science into spectacle. In the buzzing belts and glowing violet rays of the past, we glimpse both the folly of quackery and the seed of modern innovation. And we are left with a haunting truth: when faced with sickness, humans will always seek the spark, the hum, the promise of a cure, even if it means strapping themselves into machines that may do more harm than good. At the dawn of the 20th century, science seemed to have unlocked the secrets of the universe. In 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie announced the discovery of a mysterious, glowing substance, radium. It shimmered faintly in the dark, radiating energy unlike anything humanity had ever seen. To scientists, it was a breakthrough, a force that seemed limitless. To the public, it was magic in mineral form. Radium became the symbol of modernity, of progress, of health itself. But as fascination grew, so too did a strange and deadly industry, an age when people willingly drank, wore, and even painted themselves with radioactivity, convinced it was the elixir of life. The allure was immediate. Newspapers celebrated radium as a miracle element, a substance that seemed to defy nature. Its faint glow suggested vitality, a living energy trapped in stone. Doctors theorized that radium could stimulate cells, rejuvenate the body, and even reverse aging. Quacks and entrepreneurs seized the opportunity. Soon, products infused with radium filled the market: health tonics, beauty creams, toothpaste, even chocolates. Advertisements promised energy in every drop, encouraging consumers to bathe in the glow of modern science. To drink radium water, it was said, was to sip the future. Perhaps the most infamous of these products was Radithor, a patent medicine sold in the 1920s. Each bottle contained distilled water laced with small amounts of radium, marketed as a cure for fatigue, arthritis, impotence, and virtually every other ailment. Wealthy businessmen, athletes, and even doctors themselves swore by it. One of its most famous users, industrialist Eben Byers, consumed bottle after bottle daily. At first, he declared it gave him vitality, strength, and youthful energy. But within a few years, his jaw began to rot away, his bones crumbled, and holes appeared in his skull. Byers' gruesome death was publicized in newspapers, a chilling warning of the dangers of radioactivity. Yet even as his body decayed, advertisements for radium products continued, riding the wave of public fascination. It wasn't only tonics. Radium seeped into everyday life in astonishing ways. Beauty companies sold glowing face creams, claiming they would keep skin youthful and radiant. Radium toothpaste promised to whiten teeth and strengthen gums. Radium underwear was marketed as invigorating, restoring vitality through constant contact with the radioactive fabric. Even children's toys were manufactured with radioactive paints, their faint glow in the dark marketed as both safe and fun. The message was clear: if you wanted to be modern, healthy, and strong, radium was the answer. But perhaps the darkest chapter of the radium craze was written not in pharmacies or beauty shops, but in the factories of America. During World War I and the years that followed, young women were hired to paint luminous dials on watches, clocks, and instrument panels using radium-based paint. The work was considered prestigious and safe, and the paint's glow was enchanting. To sharpen their brushes, the workers were instructed to put the bristles between their lips, lip pointing, as it was called, unwittingly ingesting tiny amounts of radium with every stroke. The consequences were devastating. The women, later known as the Radium Girls, began to suffer mysterious illnesses. Their teeth fell out, their jaws crumbled, their bones weakened until they fractured under the simplest movements. Some developed deadly cancers, others endured years of pain as their skeletons literally disintegrated from within. Yet when they sought justice, the companies denied responsibility, insisting radium was harmless. The women's suffering, and their courage in suing their employers, became one of the earliest public health battles over corporate accountability and workplace safety. Their tragic story exposed the dark side of the radium craze. While the element was sold as health, it was silently poisoning those who handled it most closely. What makes this period so haunting is not only the suffering it caused, but the optimism that fueled it. Radium embodied the spirit of progress, the belief that science could conquer all ills. Its glow seemed a symbol of vitality, of life itself radiating outward. People were willing to overlook its dangers, or even embrace them, convinced that small amounts of poison must surely stimulate the body rather than destroy it. Doctors prescribed it, patients demanded it, and corporations profited from it. The line between medicine and marketing blurred, leaving tragedy in its wake. Yet, strangely enough, the fascination with radium was not entirely misplaced. In controlled forms, radioactivity did find legitimate medical uses. Radium therapy became a pioneering treatment for cancer, as its rays could target and destroy malignant cells. Hospitals built radium clinics, where carefully measured doses were applied to tumors with real success. This duality, the same element serving both as poison and as cure, captures the paradox of the radium age. It was not purely quackery, but a mixture of genuine discovery and reckless exploitation. Walking through advertisements from the 1920s, one is struck by the confidence with which radium was sold. Posters showed glowing bottles promising energy, vitality, even sexual prowess. Women were depicted applying luminous creams, their faces radiant with youthful vigor. Men were told that radium could restore virility and strength. It was the same pattern seen throughout medical history: the more desperate the need, the greater the willingness to believe. And in an age of rapid industrial change, when science seemed to promise unlimited progress, radium was the ultimate symbol of modern faith. Today, the remnants of that craze sit behind glass in museums, their faint glow diminished but still dangerous. Bottles of radithor, jars of radium face cream, luminous watches, all silent reminders of a time when poison was sold as health. The story of radium is not simply one of folly, but of the human desire to believe in miracles. It warns us that progress, when mixed with desperation and profit, can blind us to dangers hidden in plain sight. The radium craze ended slowly, as deaths mounted and regulations tightened. By the 1930s and 1940s, awareness of radiation's dangers grew, and public trust began to crumble. Yet even then, the promise of radioactivity lingered, finding its way into new medical treatments and industrial applications. The glow that once enchanted the world did not vanish, it was merely tamed, reshaped into the controlled tools of modern nuclear medicine. But the question remains: how different are we, really, from those who sipped glowing tonics and painted their faces with radioactive cream? Our own age is filled with miracle supplements, high-tech gadgets, and wellness fads, all promising vitality, youth, and longevity. Like radium, many are embraced before their risks are fully understood. And so the story of radium is not just history, it is a mirror, reflecting our timeless hunger for cures that shine too brightly to ignore. The 20th century is often remembered as the dawn of modern medicine, a time when antibiotics, vaccines, and advanced surgery revolutionized health. Yet hidden beneath these triumphs lies a darker story, one of desperation, experimentation, and cruelty disguised as progress. In psychiatric hospitals and clinics across Europe and America, patients endured treatments that now seem barbaric: insulin shock therapy and lobotomies. Both were born from genuine hope to cure mental illness, but both left trails of shattered lives and haunting images of human suffering in the name of science. The story of insulin shock therapy began in the 1920s and 1930s, when Austrian physician Manfred Sockel introduced the radical idea of inducing comas in psychiatric patients. By injecting massive doses of insulin, doctors could drive blood sugar to dangerously low levels, causing patients to convulse, sweat, and ultimately fall into a coma. Sometimes, they would be revived with glucose; other times, the outcome was less certain. Sockel believed that this process reset the brain, breaking the cycle of schizophrenia or severe depression. At a time when psychiatric wards were overcrowded and hopeless, his claims of improvement were celebrated as miraculous. Soon, insulin coma therapy spread like wildfire. Hospitals opened special wards for the procedure, with rows of beds filled by patients slipping in and out of drug-induced unconsciousness. Doctors monitored their twitching bodies, ready with sugar solutions to pull them back from the brink. In some cases, patients underwent dozens, even hundreds, of these treatments. Families, desperate for cures, consented, encouraged by physicians who spoke confidently of recovery. For a while, the results seemed promising. Some patients did show temporary improvement, calmer moods, or fewer hallucinations. But many others suffered seizures, brain damage, or death. The treatment's dangers were immense, but its popularity persisted for decades, fueled by a mixture of scientific optimism and the grim reality that psychiatry had so few tools to offer. If insulin shock seemed extreme, the lobotomy was even more so. In the 1930s, Portuguese neurologist Antonio Agos Moniz developed the procedure he called leucotomy, cutting into the brain's frontal lobes to treat psychiatric disorders. Moniz believed that by severing certain neural pathways, he could relieve symptoms of depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. His patients often emerged subdued, docile, and stripped of violent or disruptive behaviors. To Moniz and his supporters, this was proof of success. In 1949, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, cementing the lobotomy as a legitimate therapy in the eyes of the medical establishment. In the United States, the lobotomy's most notorious champion was Dr. Walter Freeman, a charismatic but controversial figure who turned the operation into a mass practice. Freeman popularized the icepick lobotomy, a technique in which a sharp instrument resembling an ice pick was inserted through the patient's eye socket and tapped into the brain with a mallet. With a few quick movements, the frontal lobes were disrupted. The procedure took only minutes, required no sterile operating theater, and could be performed in office settings, or even on stage, as Freeman sometimes demonstrated to crowds of onlookers. Freeman drove across America in his lobotomobile, performing thousands of procedures in hospitals, asylums, and sometimes even private homes. His patients ranged from violent schizophrenics to depressed housewives, from war veterans struggling with trauma to teenagers deemed unruly. In all, tens of thousands of lobotomies were performed in the United States between the 1940s and 1950s. For families, it often felt like a last resort. For doctors, it seemed like a miracle tool to manage overcrowded institutions. And for patients, it was a gamble that often ended in tragedy. The results were mixed, and frequently horrific. Some patients did become calmer, less agitated, but at a cost. Many were left with permanent cognitive damage, unable to plan, reason, or control their impulses. Some lost their personalities entirely, reduced to childlike dependence. Others suffered seizures, paralysis, or death. The operation's brutal simplicity masked its devastating consequences. Yet Freeman pressed on, convinced he was liberating the mentally ill. Photographs from the era show rows of patients, eyes vacant, their once vibrant lives dimmed by the operation's blunt hand. These treatments thrived in a climate of desperation. Mental illness in the early 20th century was poorly understood, and psychiatric hospitals were overflowing. Families begged for solutions, and doctors, eager to help, clutched at anything that seemed to offer hope. Insulin shock and lobotomies were not pursued out of cruelty but out of a tragic combination of optimism, arrogance, and limited knowledge. The suffering they caused, however, is undeniable. They remind us that medicine, even with the best of intentions, can inflict horrors when guided by desperation rather than evidence. By the 1950s, the tide began to turn. The introduction of antipsychotic drugs like chlorpromazine offered safer alternatives, and studies revealed the devastating long-term effects of lobotomies and shock therapies. Insulin coma wards closed, and Freeman's icepick fell into disrepute. But by then, the damage had been done, tens of thousands of lives had been altered or destroyed. The very treatments once hailed as breakthroughs became symbols of medical hubris, cautionary tales etched into the history of psychiatry. To look back on these practices is to feel both horror and humility. Horror at the suffering inflicted, humility at the realization that those who performed them believed they were helping. It forces us to ask, what treatments of our own time, celebrated today, might be condemned tomorrow? Are there therapies we embrace, whether experimental drugs, invasive surgeries, or untested psychological interventions, that future generations will view with the same disbelief we feel toward lobotomies? The stories of insulin shock and lobotomies show the danger of confusing control with cure, of mistaking silence for healing. They reveal how science, when untethered from compassion and caution, can slide into cruelty. And they remind us that the human mind is not a machine to be reset with shocks or reshaped with blades, but a fragile, complex mystery that resists easy answers. In the end, these 20th-century horrors stand as monuments to the dark side of progress. They warn us that medicine is not only about discovery, it is about responsibility. For when the vulnerable place their trust in the hands of healers, the cost of failure is not just scientific, it is human. Long before microscopes revealed bacteria and laboratories distilled vaccines, healing was as much about faith and ritual as it was about herbs and instruments. In villages, forests, and city streets across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, medicine was not confined to physicians in white coats, it lived in the hands of wise women, cunning men, and traveling healers who mixed remedies with prayers, charms, and spells. To dismiss these traditions as mere superstition is to miss their place in history. Folk remedies, magic, and witchcraft were not curiosities at the margins of society, they were the everyday medicine of millions, blending the mystical and the practical in ways that often defy easy judgment. Imagine a medieval household struck by illness. A child writhes with fever, the family desperate and poor, unable to summon a physician. Instead, they turn to the village healer, a woman known for her knowledge of herbs and charms. She grinds a mixture of garlic and sage, ties it in a pouch, and hangs it around the child's neck. She whispers a prayer, sprinkles salt across the threshold to keep out evil spirits, and instructs the parents to burn juniper branches to purify the air. To us, these rituals might seem powerless, but to them, they offered both hope and a sense of control over forces otherwise incomprehensible. The belief that illness was not merely physical but spiritual shaped countless remedies. Witchcraft, far from being an exotic or rare practice, often overlapped with folk medicine. Charms were worn to ward off the evil eye, incantations recited to ease childbirth, and protective symbols drawn on doors to keep out plague. In some cultures, illnesses were thought to be curses cast by envious neighbors or malicious spirits. Healing, then, required more than herbs, it required breaking spells, counteracting curses, or invoking divine intervention. A healer's power rested not just in their knowledge of plants but in their ability to stand between the visible world and the unseen. Plants themselves were infused with magical meaning. Mandrake root, with its human-like shape, was believed to scream when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who heard it. Yet pieces of it were prized as charms against infertility and as ingredients in potions. Belladonna, known as deadly nightshade, was both poison and medicine, used in minute doses to dilate pupils or ease pain, but also in witchcraft brews said to induce visions or flight. Wormwood, mugwort, and henbane carried reputations as both healing herbs and tools of sorcery. The very same plants that filled apothecary jars in universities also filled the pouches of village witches, different contexts, but often the same roots. Folk remedies were not confined to Europe. Across Africa, traditional healers known as sangomas or shamans combined herbal medicine with rituals of divination and spirit communication. In Asia, practices like Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine blended cosmology, philosophy, and plant-based cures in systems that survive to this day. In the Americas, indigenous peoples used tobacco in sacred healing ceremonies, mixed herbs into poultices, and performed rituals to restore balance between body, spirit, and community. Everywhere, healing was holistic, touching body and soul, rooted in the belief that sickness was never purely physical. This blending of magic and medicine often brought healers into conflict with religious and political authorities. During Europe's witch hunts, countless women accused of witchcraft were, in truth, local healers whose remedies threatened the power of established churches and physicians. A woman who knew how to ease childbirth, cure fevers with herbs, or protect crops with charms could be both indispensable and dangerous. When misfortune struck, whether plague, famine, or unexplained death, such women became scapegoats, their practices condemned as diabolical. Yet even as some were persecuted, others continued to serve their communities, proof that need outweighed fear. The line between sanctioned medicine and witchcraft was often blurry. Learned physicians might prescribe amulets engraved with astrological symbols, or recommend prayers to specific saints alongside herbs. Soldiers in the 30 Years' War carried charms for protection, blessed by priests but indistinguishable from the talismans of folk magicians. Even monarchs indulged in magical cures. Elizabeth I was said to trust in astrologers, and French kings sought holy relics to heal them of disease. If folk remedies were superstition, then superstition was woven through every level of society. What is striking is how many folk remedies contained kernels of truth. Garlic, used as protection against evil, also contains antibacterial properties. Honey, smeared on wounds as a magical salve, has natural antiseptic effects. Willow bark, long brewed into teas by healers, contains salicin, the basis for aspirin. Even the spider webs pressed to wounds in cottages carried compounds that aided clotting. These remedies survived not just because of belief, but because in some cases, they worked. Magic and medicine were not mutually exclusive, they were partners in the struggle to survive. To look back on folk remedies and witchcraft is to see the deep human need to explain suffering. Where science offered none, magic filled the void. The amulet against the evil eye, the whispered charm over a newborn's cradle, the herb brewed under a full moon, these were not nonsense to those who used them. They were anchors of meaning in a world where death lurked in every corner, where fevers struck without warning, and where childbirth was a gamble. Healing was not just about the body, it was about restoring order to a universe that felt hostile and chaotic. Today, many of these traditions live on, not as mainstream medicine, but in alternative practices, folk customs, and spiritual healing movements. People still carry charms, burn herbs, and seek out healers who promise more than conventional science can explain. The persistence of these practices is not a failure of progress, it is a reminder that healing is never just physical. We crave rituals, symbols, and stories as much as we crave medicine. And in this way, the magic of the past is not as far removed from the present as we might like to think. The story of folk remedies and witchcraft is, ultimately, a story of survival. It shows us how humans, armed with little knowledge but boundless imagination, confronted the terror of illness. They created meaning where none was clear, built rituals from fear, and turned the ordinary into the extraordinary. To dismiss them as ignorant is to misunderstand their world. They were not foolish, they were human, and in their charms, potions, and prayers, they remind us that healing is never just about the body, but about hope. History often paints medicine as a march from ignorance to enlightenment, a steady progression from superstition to science. But the truth is far messier. The strangest treatments, the ones we laugh at or recoil from today, sometimes carried within them the seeds of genuine discovery. Quackery and science were not always opposites, they overlapped, blended, and sometimes even gave birth to one another. What looked like madness in one century could become a breakthrough in the next. To study this uneasy border is to see that medicine has never been a straight path, but a winding road filled with dead ends, strange detours, and accidental triumphs. Take, for example, the case of the foxglove plant. For centuries, folk healers brewed teas and tinctures from its leaves, often with dangerous results. In the wrong dose, foxglove could stop the heart. But in small amounts, it slowed and steadied the pulse. Villagers swore by it as a remedy for dropsy, what we now call congestive heart failure. Learned physicians scoffed at such rustic cures, dismissing them as dangerous nonsense. Yet in the late 18th century, English Dr. William Withering studied the plant carefully, recording its effects. From his work came digitalis, one of the first truly effective heart medicines. What had once been witchcraft became science, simply because someone looked closely instead of turning away. Accidental discoveries abound in medicine. In 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold called penicillium killed bacteria growing in his petri dishes. Before that, moldy bread had long been pressed to wounds in folk tradition, dismissed as a superstition. Yet within that strange practice lay the hidden power of penicillin, the world's first antibiotic. A cure that changed the trajectory of history had roots in what might once have been seen as peasant quackery. Even the leech, so often mocked as a symbol of medieval ignorance, found redemption in modern times. While bloodletting nearly killed countless patients, leeches were reintroduced in the 20th century for microsurgery. Their saliva contains anticoagulants that prevent clots and promote circulation, vital for reattaching severed limbs or repairing delicate tissues. What had seemed barbaric became a precise medical tool. The line between folly and wisdom had shifted, drawn anew by the scalpel of science. This pattern, of strange cures hiding useful truths, appears again and again. Mercury, though devastating in the treatment of syphilis, laid the foundation for arsenic-based drugs like salvarsan, one of the first targeted therapies against the disease. Quinine, once dismissed as a bitter bark used by indigenous healers in South America, became the cornerstone of malaria treatment. Even radiation, so recklessly consumed in tonics and face creams, was eventually harnessed into radiotherapy, a mainstay of cancer treatment. The same elements that poison became life-saving, depending on dose, context, and understanding. What makes the boundary between quackery and discovery so fascinating is that it is not fixed. It moves with time, with knowledge, with culture. The treatments we dismiss today as absurd may one day find legitimacy. Conversely, the cures we celebrate now may be condemned in the future as reckless or harmful. Consider chemotherapy, potent poisons deliberately used to kill cancer cells. To someone from the 18th century, it would look indistinguishable from the deadly concoctions of alchemists. Yet it works, saving lives every day. Or think of modern gene editing, hailed as revolutionary but feared by some as tampering with nature. How will future generations judge these practices? Will they see them as breakthroughs, or as horrors we could not recognize in our own time? The thin line also reveals the role of belief in healing. For centuries, patients accepted treatments that made little sense because they trusted in the authority of the physician, the ritual of the cure, or the promise of modernity. Sometimes, that belief carried them through until science caught up. Placebos, though biologically inert, often brought real relief, showing that faith itself could be a kind of medicine. When patients drank radium water, endured electric shocks, or submitted to charms and potions, they were participating in a larger truth, that healing is not just physical, but psychological. And sometimes, belief paved the way for genuine discovery. The danger, of course, lies in exploitation. Quacks have always thrived in the shadows of uncertainty, selling miracle cures for profit while patients suffer. But even in their deceptions, they sometimes stumbled upon ideas that later proved useful. The snake oil salesman, after all, may have unknowingly bottled omega-rich fish oils. The magnet healer may have intuited something about electromagnetic fields that science would only later refine. This does not excuse the harm done, but it complicates the story. The boundary between charlatan and pioneer is thinner than we like to believe. To walk through a museum of medical history is to see this tension on every shelf. Jars of powdered mummy, radium-laced face creams, vibrating belts, and leech jars sit beside the instruments of modern surgery. What unites them is not their validity, but their intention, to heal. Each represents a society's attempt to wrestle with the unknown, to make sense of suffering, to turn hope into action. Some succeeded brilliantly, others disastrously. But all are part of the same story, the relentless human struggle against illness and death. The lesson of this uneasy border is humility. It reminds us that medicine is not a story of fools and geniuses, but of humans groping in the dark, sometimes stumbling, sometimes finding treasure. It reminds us that our own age, with its high-tech treatments and pharmaceutical marvels, is not immune to error or hubris. One day, people may look back at chemotherapy, opioid painkillers, or even routine surgeries with the same mixture of horror and amusement we reserve for leeches and lobotomies. Progress is real, but it is never perfect. In the end, the thin line between quackery and discovery is less a boundary than a spectrum. On one end lies blind faith, on the other, proven science, but in between, a vast gray area where experiments, accidents, and strange ideas overlap. It is in that middle space that many of medicine's most important breakthroughs have been born. The challenge is to learn from history, to remain open to the unexpected without surrendering to deception, and to remember that even the strangest cures may carry within them the spark of truth.